In many true crime stories I have told involving some of the world's worst people, there is always a silver lining at the end, with the brutal criminal going to prison or their lives coming to an end, putting a stop on their reign of terror. No matter how bad the crime may be, we can at least say this person got what they deserved. Unfortunately, this will not be the case in this next true crime video, and if homicide was a sport, then Pedro Lopez would be a gold medalist winner. We're talking about hundreds of bodies. This is the brutal, horrifying story of America's most prolific serial killer, Pedro Lopez, who is still at large. Pedro Alonso Lopez was born in Colombia in 1948 and raised by his mother, Benilda Lopez de Castaneda, who conceived Pedro after having an affair with a married man. And like many serial killers, Lopez had a traumatic childhood. Lopez's father had his life ended 6 months before Pedro was born. The first known instance of trauma in Lopez's life was witnessing his mother engage in sex work, which he claimed had a disturbing effect on his psyche. While Lopez's mother claimed to be loving and caring, Pedro Lopez said she was physically and emotionally abusive. Pedro Lopez's life took a twisted turn in 1957 when his mother caught him fondling his sister. He was kicked out of his home at the age of 9, and while wandering the streets, Pedro Lopez was picked up by a child predator who lured him into his home with the promise of food and a place to stay. Instead, Pedro was taken to an abandoned building and sexually assaulted repeatedly. After this incident, Pedro joined a street gang of children to protect himself from further predation. The gang would commit petty crimes and smoke a derivative of drugs. After 4 years of living on the street, Pedro was taken in by a family from the United States and put in a school for orphans. The nightmares in Pedro's life did not end there, because not long after he ran away because he was sexually assaulted by his math teacher, but other accounts claimed he ran away with the same teacher. Back on the streets and 18 years old, Pedro Lopez started making a living by stealing cars and selling them to local chop shops. Eventually, he was caught by the police and sent to prison. While in prison, Lopez was sexually assaulted by 3 other inmates. In an act of retaliation, Lopez fashioned himself a weapon and ended the lives of all 3 men who assaulted him, one of them with his bare hands. This retaliation earned him the respect of his fellow inmates, none of which ever tried to harm him again. The slangs were also considered to be in self-defense by the Colombian justice system, so only 2 years was added to Lopez's sentence. This incident would mark the beginning of a long string of brutal crimes and legal free passes that were to come, and where the terror in the Andes was born. Once Pedro Lopez was released from prison, he moved to Peru and his reign of terror ensued. He began kidnapping, sexually assaulting, and ending the lives of girls with horrendous frequency. At the height of his crime spree, he was slaughtering around 3 girls per week. Many of his victims were girls between the ages of 9 and 12. When asked about his motivation for ending the lives of these young girls, he said, "I lost my innocence at a young age of 8, so I decided to do the same to as many girls as I could."
No, pues cuando uno se muere, pues pierde uno por total, pierde uno lo que es los sentimientos, su visibilidad de los ojos para ver, y una muerte que uno ya no vuelve ni saber quién es uno, ¿no? Todo queda así en una oscuridad nula.
Lopez would stalk his victims from afar, sometimes for several days before making his move. Then he kidnapped the girl, lead them to a secluded place, sexually assault them, and strangle them to death. He would bury their bodies in shallow graves. Sometimes before the bodies had decomposed too much, he'd return to the graves, dig them up, and have tea parties and play dress-up with a group of corpses. Pedro claimed that he preferred to strike during the day so that he could see his victims' faces as they died. Most of his victims were girls from poor indigenous communities. According to Lopez, he didn't have a preference of which ethnicity his victims were. It was simply a matter of practicality that most of his victims were from the indigenous communities where children were looked after less closely.
Esto queda en la historia, ¿sí o no? ¿Sí me van a pasar al paredón? Yo estoy muy joven para morir.
On one occasion, Pedro was caught in the act of trying to kidnap a girl from one of these communities. The locals beat him, tortured him, and eventually buried him up to his neck. They planned to cover his head in syrup and let the ants eat him alive. But he was saved when an ambassador from the United States convinced them to let him go free. Now, what's even crazier is that during this time in Peru, there was an epidemic of young children going missing. So the locals in these communities watching this man kidnap this girl, it set off alarms that he could also be behind other disappearances. Yet the United States ambassador convinced these communities to let this man go free. I'm telling you, in a lot of these crimes, the rabbit hole runs deep, and there's higher players involved. On another occasion, in Ecuador this time, Lopez was again caught in the act of trying to kidnap a girl by the girl's mother. When the mother began to shout for help, an angry mob formed that would have lynched Lopez right there on the spot if he hadn't been rescued by police officers. The officers eventually took Lopez into custody and interrogated him. It was at this point that the true extent of Pedro's crimes were revealed. At first, the interrogators believed that Lopez was a part of a gang that had been abducting girls around Ambato, Ecuador. No one could have ever imagined that so many missing children could be traced back to a single man. However, Lopez eventually confessed that he had ended the life of one of the missing girls police were looking for. When the officers asked him if he had ended the lives of any more girls, Lopez replied, over 200 in Ecuador, some 10s in Peru, and many more in Colombia, as he smirked. He was not being facetious, he was not joking. Lopez led the authorities to 53 shallow graves that he dug around Ambato, and several more that he used to bury victims in other parts of the country. While authorities confirmed he ended the lives of at least 110 people, some estimates point that number to be extremely higher. And when I say higher, I don't mean 100 more, I don't mean 200 more. Authorities do believe this man ended the lives of almost 500 people. And even though investigators did indeed confirm Pedro Lopez slaughtered and sexually assaulted over 110 girls, he was only sentenced to 16 years in prison. Correct, I am not making this up. He is confirmed to have 110 bodies, some estimates saying it could be closer to 500, but was only given 16 years in prison, which 16 years in Ecuador is the maximum sentence for murder. So it doesn't matter if you end the life of one person or 1,000, you will only receive 16 years. If you have been subscribed to me for quite a while and watched a lot of my true crime videos, then you will know that the justice system sometimes plays as a secondary antagonist, and here is no different, because unfortunately, yet not surprisingly, Lopez was released 2 years early, in 1994, for being a model prisoner and exhibiting good behavior. He didn't even get to serve the whole maximum sentence of 16 years for murder in Ecuador, which 16 years is crazy in itself, but he was still released 2 years early. This is probably one of the most shocking true crime stories I've ever told when it comes to the justice system. And also, not surprising, within an hour of being released, he struck again, sexually assaulting and slaying another girl in front of her mother by strangulation. He fled the home but was arrested for illegally crossing the border into Ecuador and deported back to his home country of Colombia. In 1995, Pedro Lopez was put on trial in Colombia for murder, but he was declared insane and sent to a mental hospital instead of prison. He remained at the hospital for 3 years until 1998, when a second psychological evaluation deemed him sane, and he was released on the condition that he pay $50 bail and report to the police monthly. Now, I do want to ask anybody that's watching this video, do you believe Pedro Lopez, the man who may have ended the lives of over 500 people, confirmed over 110, showed up to report to the police. Of course not. In fact, no one really knows where he is to this day. The last known sighting of Pedro Lopez was by his own mother, who he visited in his hometown of El Espinal. When he arrived at her house, his mother was sure that Pedro was there to end her life. Instead, he told her to get down on her knees, and he gave her a blessing. In 2002, the Colombian government launched an Interpol of arrest against Lopez for a fresh homicide that they do believe he is linked to. Rumors say that he is currently living in Tolima department in Colombia as a homeless man. Others say that the relatives of his victims put a bounty on his head and ended his life. Others do believe he may have crossed into the United States and is lurking in the shadows. No one really knows. You may have even walked past the world's most prolific serial killer on the streets, or even in a grocery store, and had no idea. Thank you so much for watching. If you do like my videos and my way of storytelling, please subscribe. If you're already subscribed, please like the video, as any engagement can help the channel grow. Once again, thank you so much for your support.